Hello Mark, my name is Peter, and my student number is 55. I'm a freshman. Now I'm going to read a speech, Theaster Gate, how to revive a neighborhood with imagination, beauty, and art. I'm a reporter, which seems a very humble vocation. I know a lot about pots. I've spent about 50 years making them. One of the things that really excite me in my artistic practice and being trained as a porter is that you very quickly learn how to make great things out of nothing. That I spend a lot of time in my well with mounds of clay trying stuff. And that's the limitation of my capacity. My ability was based on my hands and my imagination. That if I wanted to make a really nice bowl and I didn't know how to make a food yet, I would have to learn how to make a food. That process of learning has been very helpful to my life. I feel like as a porter, you also start to learn how to shape the world. There have been times in my artistic capacity that I wanted to reflect on other really important moments in the history of the US. The history of the world would how things happen. But how do you talk about thought ideas without separating people from that content? Could I use art like this old, discontinued firehouse from Alabama to talk about the complexity of a moment of civil rights in the 60s? Is it possible to talk about my father and I doing labor project? My dad was a roofer, construction guy. He owned rights in he owned small business, and at 80, he was ready to retire, and his tar kettle was my inheritance. Now, a tar kettle doesn't sound like much of an inheritance. It wasn't. It was stinky and it took up a lot of space in my studio. But I asked my dad if he would be willing to make some art with me. If we could reimage this kind of nothing material as something very special, and by elevating the material and my dad's skills, could we start to think about it? Could we start to think about art just like clay, in a new way, shaping it differently, helping us to imagine what was possible? After clay, I was then kind of turned onto lots of different kinds of materials, and my studio grew a lot because I thought, well, it's not really about the material. It's about our capacity to shape things. I became more and more interested in ideas and more things that were happening just outside my studio. Just to give you a little bit of context, I live in Chicago. I live on South Side now. I'm a West Sider. For those of you who are not Chicagoans, that won't mean anything. But if I didn't mention that I was a West Sider, there would be a lot of people in the city that would be very upset. The neighborhood that I live in is Grand Crossing. It's a neighborhood that has seen better days. It is not a gated community by far. There's lots of abandonment in my neighborhood. And while I was kind of busy making pots and busy marking art and having a good art career, there was all of this stuff that was happening just outside my studio. All of us know about falling housing market and challenge of blight. And I feel like we talk about it with some of our cities more than others. But I think a lot of our US cities and beyond have the challenge of blight. Abandoned building that people no longer know what to do anything with. And so I thought, is there a way that I could start to think about this building as an extension and expansion of my artistic practice? And that if I were thinking going with other creativities, architects, engineers, real estate finance people, that us together might be able to kind of think in more complicated ways about the reshaping of city. And so I bought a building. The building was really affordable. We tried it out. We made it as beautiful as we could to try to just get some activity happening on my block. Once I bought a building for about $18,000. We didn't have any money left, so I started sweeping the building as kind of performance. This is performance art, and people would come over, and I would start sweeping. Because the broom was free and sweeping was free, it worked out. After, but we would use the building then to stage exhibitions, some dinners, and we found that the building on my block, Dorchester. We now refer to the block as Dorchester Project. That in a way, that building became a kind of gathering site for lots of different kinds of activity. We turned the building into what we call now the archive house. The archive house would do all of these amazing things. Very significant people in the city and beyond would find themselves in the middle of the hood. And that's when I feel like maybe there was a relationship between my history with clay and this new thing that was starting to develop. That we were slowly starting to reshape how people imagine the south side of the city. One house turned into a few houses, and we always try to suggest that not only is creating a beautiful vessel important, but the contents of what happened in those buildings is also very important. So we were not only thinking about development, but we were thinking about the program. Thinking about the kind of connection that could happen between one house and another, between the one neighbor and another. This building became what we call the listening house, and it has a collection of discarded books from the Johnson Publishing Corporation, and other books from the old bookstore that was going out of business. I was actually just wanting to achieve this building as much as I could with whatever and whoever just joined me. In Chicago, there's amazing building stock. This building, which had been the former crack house on the block, and when the building became abandoned, it became a great opportunity to really imagine what else could happen there. So this space we convert into what we call Black Cinema House. Black Cinema House was an opportunity in the hood to screen films that were important and relevant to the folk who live around me. That if we wanted to show the old Melvin Van Peebles film, we could. If we wanted to show Car Wash, we could. That would be awesome. The building was soon outgrew, and we had to move a larger space, Black Cinema House, which was made from just a small piece of clay, had to grow into a much larger piece of clay, which is now my studio. What I realized was that for those of you who were zoning junkies, that some of things that I was doing in this building that had been left behind. They were not the uses by which the building were built, and that there are city policies that say, hey, a house that is residential needs to stay residential. But what do you do in neighborhoods when ain't anybody interested in living there? That the people would have the means to live have already lived. What do we do with these abandoned buildings? And so I was trying to wake them up using culture. We found that was so exciting for folks, and people were so responsive to the work that we had to then find bigger buildings. By the time we found bigger buildings, there was in part the resources necessary to think about those things. In this bank that we call the Arts Bank, it was in pretty bad shape. There was about 6 feet of standing water. It was a difficult project to finance because banks weren't interested in the neighborhood just because people weren't interested in the neighborhood because nothing had happened there. It was dirt. It was nothing. It was nowhere. It was nowhere. And so we just started imagining and what else could happen in this building. Applause. And so now that the rumor of my blog has spread, and lots of people are starting to visit, we found that the bank can now be a center can now be the center for exhibition, archives, music, performance, and that there are people who are now interested in being adjacent to those buildings because we brought some heat, that we kind of made a fire. One of the archives that we have there is Johnson Publish Corporation. We have also started to collect memorable from American history, from people who live or have lived in that neighborhood. Some of these images are degraded images of black people, kind of history of very challenging content. And where better than a neighborhood with young people who are constantly asking themselves about their identity to talk about some of the complexity of race and class. In some ways, the bank represents the hub that we are trying to create a pretty hand-core knot of cultural activity. And that if we could start to make multiple hubs and connect some cool green stuff around there, that a building that will be projects and rehab, which now is around 60 or 70 units, that if we could land miniature Versailles on top of that and connect this building by the beautiful green belt, applause. That this place where people never wanted to be would become an important destination for folks from all over the country and world. In some ways, it feels very much like I'm the porter, that we tackle the things that are at our well. We're trying with the skill that we have to think about this next bowl and I want to make. And it went from the bowl to a singular house, to a block, to a neighborhood, to a cultural district, to thinking about the city. And at every point, there were things that I didn't know that I had to learn. I've never learned so much about zoning law in my life. I never thought that I did have to. But as a result of that, I'm finding that there's not just room for my own artistic practice. There's a room for a lot of other artistic practice. So the people starting asking us, well, Theaster, how are you going to go to scale? And what's your sustainability plan? Laughter, applause. And what I found was that I couldn't export myself. That what seems necessary in cities like Akron, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan, and Gary, Indiana, is that there are people in those places who really believe in those places, that are already dying to make those places beautiful. And that often, those people who are passionate about the place are disconnecting from the resources necessary to make cool things happen. Or disconnected from the contingency of people that could help make this happen. So now, we are starting to give advice around the country on how to start with what you got, how to start with the things that are in front of you, how to make something out of nothing, how to reshape your world at a well, or at your block, or at the scale of the city. Thank you so much. Applause. Jun Cohen, thank you. So I think many people watching this will be asking themselves the question you just raised at the end. How can they do this in their own city? You can't export yourself. Give us a few pages out of your playbook about what someone who is inspired about the city can do to take on projects that like yours. Theaster Gates. One of the things that I found that's really important is giving thought to not just the kind of individual project, not an old house, but what's happened relationship between an old house, a local school, a small boja, and is there some kind of synergy between those things? Can you get those folk talking? I've found that in cases where neighborhoods have failed, they still often have a pause. How do you identify to pause in that place? That's passionate people. And then how do you get folk who have been fighting, slogging for 20 years, renegades about the place that they live? And so someone has to do that work. If I were a traditional developer, I would be talking about buildings alone, and then putting a for lease sign in the window. I think that you actually have to correct more than that. That there's a way in which you have to be mindful about. What are the business that I want to grow here? And then, are there people who live in this place who want to grow those business with me? Because I think it's not just a cultural space or housing. There has to be a recreation of an economic core. So thinking about those things together feel right. JC, it's hard to get people to create spark again when people have been slogging for 20 years. How are there any methods you have found that have helped break through? TG. Yeah, I think that now there are lots of examples of folk who are doing amazing work. But those methods are sometimes like when the media is constantly saying that only violent things happen in the place, then based on your skill set and the particular context, what are the things that you can do in your neighborhood to kind of fight some of that? So, I have found that if you are a theater person, you have outdoor street theater festival. In some cases, we don't have the resources in certain neighborhoods to do things that are certain kind of splashy. But if we can then find ways of making sure that people who are local to a place, plus people who could be supportive of the things that are happening locally, when those people get together, I think really amazing thing can happen. So interesting. And how can you make sure that the projects you are creating are actually for the disadvantaged and not just for the sort of vegetarian indie movie crowd that might move into a take advantage of them? TG. Right on. So I think this is where it starts to get into thick weeds. JC. Let's go there. TG. Right now. Grand Crossing is 99% black, or at least living. And we know that maybe who owns property in the place is different from who walks the street every day. So it's reasonable to say that Grand Crossing is already in the process of being something different than it is today. But are there ways to think about housing trust or land trust or the mission-based development of start to protect some of the space that happens? Because when you have 70,500 empty lots in the city, you want something to happen there, but you need entities that are not just interested in the development piece, but entities that are interested in the stabilized piece. And I feel like often the developer piece is really motivated. But the other work of the kind of neighborhood consciousness, the part doesn't live anymore. So how do you start to grow out important watchdog that ensure that the resources that are made available to new folk that are coming in are also distributed to folk who have lived in the place for a long time? JC, that makes so much sense. One more question. You made such a compelling case for beauty and the importance of beauty and the arts. There will be others who will argue that funds will be better spent on basic service for the disadvantaged. How do you combat that viewpoint or come against it? TG. I believe that beauty is the basic service. Applause. Often what I have found is that when there's a resources that have not been made available to certain under-resourced cities or neighborhood or communities, that sometimes culture is the thing that helps to ignite, and that I can do everything. But I think that there's a way in which if you can start with the culture and get people kind of revested in their place, other kinds of adjacent amenities start to grow. And then people can make a demand that is politic demand, and the political demand that are necessary to wake up our cities. They are also become very politic. JC, it makes perfect sense to me. Theaters, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you. Theaster Gates. Applause.